So there I was, Commander Rex Tank Morrison, standing in what the rest of the galaxy fondly called Earth's daycare for displaced alien spawn. Officially, it was the Terran Interspecies Rehabilitation and Care Facility. Unofficially, it was the place where every species in the galaxy dumped their unwanted kids and figured the soft-hearted humans would sort it out. And you know what? They were absolutely right. Picture this, a Tuesday morning on Earth, and I'm watching little Gloop, a translucent blob creature from the Andorian sector, trying to finger paint with actual fingers he doesn't have. Next to him, Spike, a young Thracian with natural armor plating, is very carefully not impaling the art supplies with his built-in weaponry. Meanwhile, three Vorthan cubs are arguing over who gets the blue crayon, their argument consisting entirely of harmonic screeching that somehow sounds adorable, instead of ear-splitting. My team thought I was crazy when I volunteered for this assignment. Tank, they said, you used to blow things up for a living. Now you want to change diapers? Well, joke's on them, because some of these alien kids don't even have what you'd traditionally call diapers. Do you have any idea how complicated bathroom duty gets when half your kids are methane breathers and the other half photosynthesize their waste? But here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy never quite figured out. We didn't become the galaxy's designated babysitters because we were weak. We became the babysitters because we were the only species that looked at a scared, abandoned kid from any corner of space and thought, well, obviously this little guy needs a bedtime story and some hot chocolate. The Galactic Council, bless their condescending hearts, had been patting us on the head for decades. Oh, those adorable humans, they'd say in their fancy meetings, probably while sipping whatever passed as for coffee in their respective biologies. So peaceful, so nurturing, not a violent bone in their soft little bodies. They'd allocated Earth as the official safe harbor for displaced youth across 7 sectors, figuring we were too harmless to be anything but helpful. They weren't wrong about the helpful part, mind you, but they'd completely missed the point about why we were so good at taking care of everyone else's kids. See, when you've got a species that once looked at their own planet and said, you know what this place needs, less war and more universal healthcare, you tend to develop pretty strong opinions about protecting the innocent. We'd spent the better part of 2 centuries turning our swords into plowshares, our battleships into hospital ships, and our weapons factories into schools. The rest of the galaxy saw this as evolution from barbarism to civilized society. What they didn't realize was that we hadn't gotten rid of our capacity for violence. We'd just gotten very, very particular about when we used it. Every morning I'd wake up to the sound of alien children playing in the gardens we'd built for them. Every evening I'd help tuck them into beds designed specifically for their unique physiologies. And every night, I'd file reports with the Galactic Council about their progress, their health, their happiness. It was a good life. Quiet, meaningful. The kind of existence that makes you think maybe the universe isn't such a terrible place after all. Too bad the universe was about to remind me that sometimes it absolutely is. It was 800 hours on what should have been another perfectly mundane Wednesday, when my comm unit started screaming like a Vorthan cub with a stubbed toe. I was in the middle of mediating a dispute between 2 young crystalline entities over playground territory, which is exactly as ridiculous as it sounds when you consider that crystallines communicate through light refraction, and the argument looked like a very pretty but very angry disco. Commander Morrison, came the voice of Lieutenant Radar O'Malley from our early warning station, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. We've got incoming hostiles, multiple signatures, moving fast, and they're not responding to our identification requests. I looked up at the morning sky, still busy with the regular traffic of transport ships bringing supplies, and the occasional visiting dignitary who wanted to see how the human experiment was working out. Hostiles? Radar, this is a children's facility. We're about as threatening as a basket of puppies. You sure your equipment isn't picking up a trade convoy with faulty transponders? Negative, sir. These are military vessels, Zephyrian Empire configuration. And tank? There was a pause that made my stomach drop somewhere around my boots. They're targeting the playground. Now, I want you to understand something about the Zephyrs. They're basically what happens when you take a bird of prey, make it 6 feet tall, give it delusions of grandeur, and then let it loose on the galaxy with advanced military technology. Their entire culture revolves around something they call strength through conflict, which is just a fancy way of saying they start fights and call it philosophy. But even by Zephyrin standards, bombing a playground was a new low. All staff, this is Commander Morrison, I announced over the facility-wide comm, trying to keep my voice calm while my brain was busy cataloging exactly how many ways I wanted to introduce the incoming hostiles to some basic concepts about consequences. We have a Code 7 situation. Begin immediate evacuation procedures. This is not a drill. The next few minutes were controlled chaos. My team, bless them, had drilled for this scenario even though none of us had ever expected to actually use it. Patch Williams, our chief medic, was already herding the younger kids toward the underground shelters, while Wrench Rodriguez, our head of maintenance, who could fix anything from a broken toy to a damaged life support system, was sealing the blast doors. The attack came in 3 waves. First, they took out our communications array, because apparently General Screech Talondath, yes, that was actually his name and no, I am not making this up, had read the manual on How to Attack Defenseless Facilities 101. Then they started hitting the playground equipment. I watched through a security monitor as the swing sets I'd personally installed last month turned into twisted metal, and the sandbox where little Gloop had been learning about texture became a crater. The third wave was when they made their biggest mistake. They targeted the nursery wing. I was shepherding a group of Altarian tadpoles toward the shelter when the plasma bolt hit Building C. The explosion knocked me flat, and when I got back up I could hear crying. Not the normal, everyday crying of kids who'd skinned their knees or lost their favorite toys. This was the sound of terror and pain, and it was coming from creatures who had never done anything wrong except be born into a galaxy that apparently thought orphans made acceptable target practice. That's when I made the call that changed everything. "Earth Defense Command, this is Commander Morrison at the Terran facility," I said into my emergency comm, and I want you to know that my voice was perfectly calm, even though every instinct I'd inherited from a species that had once conquered its own planet was screaming for blood. "We are under attack by Zephyrian forces. They are targeting children. Repeat, they are bombing an orphanage full of kids." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Admiral Bulldozer Thompson's voice came through, with all the warmth of vacuum-frozen nitrogen. "Copy that, tank. How many hostiles?" "Looks like a full battle group, sir. Maybe 30 ships." Another pause, shorter this time. "Tank?" "Yes, sir." "Get those kids to safety. We'll handle the rest." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the moment the galaxy learned that there's a very big difference between peaceful and harmless. What happened next was like watching someone flip a switch that had been gathering dust for about 200 years. The thing about humans is that we're really, really good at compartmentalizing. We'd spent centuries carefully storing our more violent tendencies in a box marked, "break glass in case of emergency," and apparently someone bombing our kids qualified as exactly that kind of emergency. 18 minutes after my call to Earth Defense Command, the sky above our facility started getting crowded. And I don't mean crowded like a busy shipping lane. I mean crowded like someone had decided to park the entire human fleet in our general vicinity. "Tank!" came Admiral Bulldozer Thompson's voice over a much clearer comm channel, because apparently our broken communications array had just been replaced by military-grade equipment that could probably contact the next galaxy over. "You and your people might want to stay indoors for the next little while." I was crouched in our main shelter with about 60 alien kids of various species, all of whom were looking at me with the kind of trust that makes you want to personally strangle anyone who would threaten them. "Admiral," I replied, "how exactly did we get a fleet response in under 20 minutes? There was a chuckle on the other end that sounded like a landslide with a sense of humor. "Oh, tank. You didn't think we actually got rid of all those ships, did you? We just parked them somewhere quiet and told everyone they were museums." Through the reinforced windows of our shelter, I could see Zephyrian fighters engaging what appeared to be human vessels that looked like they'd been built by people who'd read every military history book ever written and then decided to improve on all of them at once. "Museum pieces?" I asked, watching a Zephyrian cruiser discover that human museum pieces had some very modern ideas about defensive capabilities. "The Dreadnought-class ships are technically historical artifacts," the Admiral continued, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "We just never mentioned that we kept them in perfect working order, with upgrades, lots of upgrades." Little Spike, the young Thracian with the armor plating, tugged on my sleeve with one carefully controlled claw. "Commander Tank," he whispered in his species' naturally aggressive-sounding language, that somehow managed to sound adorable when coming from a kid, "are the humans going to hurt the bad birds?" I looked down at him, then at all the other kids who were hanging on every word, and realized that this was probably going to require some explanation. "Well, kids," I said, settling into what I hoped was my most reassuring storytelling voice, "remember how we always talk about how there are consequences for bad choices, and how grown-ups are supposed to protect children?" 60 pairs of eyes in about 12 different configurations all nodded at me. The thing is, humans are very serious about protecting children. Very, very serious. So when someone decides to hurt kids, we stop being the nice babysitters and start being the thing that made us good at taking care of everyone else in the first place. Gloop, our translucent friend, made a questioning sound that his universal translator rendered as, "But, Commander Tank, I thought humans were pacifists." "Oh, we are," I replied, as outside the window a Zephyr battleship learned what human engineering could accomplish when properly motivated. "We're absolutely committed to peace. We just have very strong opinions about what peace looks like, and it definitely doesn't include anyone bombing playgrounds." The comm crackled to life again. "Tank, this is Admiral Thompson. You might want to tell the kids that the scary part is almost over." I looked outside and realized that almost over was putting it mildly. The Zephyrian battle group that had been 30 ships strong about 20 minutes ago was now significantly smaller, and the remainder appeared to be broadcasting surrender signals on every frequency they could manage. "How exactly did we do that?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Turns out that when you spend 2 centuries perfecting your technology instead of using it to blow things up, you get some interesting advantages," came the reply. "Also, it helps when you're fighting people who think children make acceptable targets. Our crews are feeling pretty motivated right about now." And that, kids, was the day the galaxy learned that humans hadn't evolved beyond violence. We'd just gotten really good at choosing our targets. Now I need you to understand something about human military doctrine. We don't do things halfway. When we decided to stop fighting wars on Earth, we didn't just put down our weapons and hope for the best. We studied every conflict we'd ever been in, analyzed every mistake, learned from every victory, and then spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of warfare while simultaneously promising never to use it unless absolutely necessary. The Zephyrians were about to get a masterclass in why that had been a really good investment. "Tank," Admiral Thompson's voice came through the comm with the kind of casual tone you'd use to discuss the weather. "I'm going to give you a play-by-play here, because frankly this is the most fun I've had in decades. First lesson in human military strategy: we don't do warning shots." Through our shelter's reinforced windows, I watched what could only be described as a textbook example of complete tactical superiority. The remaining Zephyrian ships were trying to regroup into some kind of defensive formation, which would have been adorable if it wasn't so completely pointless. "See, the thing is," the Admiral continued, and I could hear weapons charging in the background, "when you attack children, you don't get the civilized version of humanity. You get the version that conquered an entire planet before breakfast and then felt bad about it. We've been saving up 2 centuries worth of technological advancement for exactly this kind of situation." The first demonstration of human ingenuity was something our engineers had apparently nicknamed gravity well deployment. I watched a Zephyrian heavy cruiser suddenly find itself unable to maneuver, as the space around it started behaving in ways that would have made Einstein weep with either joy or terror. "That's our newest toy," Admiral Thompson explained, sounding like a proud parent at a school science fair. "Localized gravitational manipulation. We originally developed it for asteroid mining, but it turns out that when you can control gravity in a localized field, enemy ships become sitting ducks." The second lesson came in the form of what appeared to be small, innocuous-looking drones that were suddenly swarming every Zephyrian vessel. "Nanite clouds," the Admiral said cheerfully. "They're programmed to disable weapon systems while leaving life support intact. We don't want to kill anyone unnecessarily, but we definitely want them to stop shooting at our kids." General Screech Talondath, who was presumably commanding this disaster from his flagship, apparently decided that retreat was the better part of valor and started trying to break off from the engagement. This turned out to be what military strategists would later classify as an optimistic but ultimately futile gesture. "Oh, that's cute," Admiral Thompson said, and I heard what sounded like targeting systems locking on. "He thinks he can just fly away after bombing an orphanage. Tank, you might want to cover the kid's ears for this next part." What followed was a demonstration of human tracking technology that was apparently several decades ahead of anything the Zephyrians had ever seen. Every time Screech's ship tried to jump to hyperspace, it found itself pulled back into normal space by tractor beams that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional physics. "We've been working on interdiction technology for about 50 years, the Admiral explained, like he was describing a hobby project. "Turns out that when you can manipulate subspace fields, running away becomes significantly more difficult." But here's where things got really interesting. Because while the Admiral was busy turning Zephyrian military doctrine into an object lesson in the dangers of underestimating peaceful species, my comm started picking up transmissions from other parts of the galaxy. Patch Williams, who had been monitoring emergency frequencies, came over with a grim expression. "Tank, we're getting reports of Zephyrian prison camps. Looks like they've been capturing alien civilians from their other conquests. Kids, mostly." That's when Admiral Thompson's voice took on a tone that could have frozen helium. Tank, change of plans. We're not just stopping this battle group. We're going to have a conversation with the entire Zephyrian Empire about acceptable behavior. The psychological warfare phase began about 10 minutes later. Human ships started broadcasting on all Zephyrian military frequencies, and the message was simple: children's laughter. Recordings from our facility, from human schools, from playgrounds across Earth. Just kids being kids, playing and laughing and being innocent. The idea, Admiral Thompson explained, is to make sure every Zephyrian soldier knows exactly what they attacked. Sometimes, the best weapon is shame. And you know what? It worked. We started getting surrender signals from Zephyrian ships across 3 sectors as word spread about what had happened. Turns out that when you force an entire military to confront the fact that they've been targeting children, most of them suddenly remember that they have consciences. The final battle, if you can call it that, lasted exactly 7 minutes. Admiral Thompson's flagship, a vessel that looked like someone had taken a city-sized hammer and decided it needed more guns, pulled alongside General Screech's command ship and simply asked for his surrender. When Screech refused, the Admiral demonstrated another piece of human technology: selective life support disruption. Suddenly, only the bridge of the Zephyrian flagship had breathable atmosphere. "General Talondeath," came Admiral Thompson's voice over an open channel, "you have 30 seconds to surrender before I demonstrate what happens when humans stop being polite. And just so we're clear, you bombed children. We are not feeling particularly generous today." The surrender came in 28 seconds. "Tank," the Admiral said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Recess is officially over. Time for some people to learn about consequences." 3 days later, I found myself standing in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council, wearing my dress uniform and trying very hard not to laugh at the expressions on about 200 different alien faces. The emergency session had been called within hours of what the news networks were already calling the playground incident, and every major species in the galaxy had sent representatives. To my right stood Admiral Thompson, looking like a man who had just discovered that Christmas came early this year. To my left were 6 of the alien children we'd rescued from Zephyrian prison camps, including little Spike and Gloop, all of them wearing matching Earth's Orphanage survivor t-shirts that Wrench had somehow managed to produce overnight. The council chamber, normally a place of dignified diplomatic discourse, currently felt more like a courtroom, where everyone was pretty sure they were about to be found guilty of something they didn't know was illegal. Chancellor Vex Thran, a dignified Altarian who served as the council's current rotating president, cleared his throat in the way that roughly translated to, "Oh, we are so incredibly screwed," across 17 different languages. "Commander Morrison," he began, and I noticed his voice had that careful tone diplomats use when they're trying very hard not to accidentally start a war. "The council has asked you here today to discuss the recent developments regarding humanity's response to the Zephyrian attack on your facility." I looked around the chamber, noting the way various ambassadors were very carefully not making eye contact, and decided this was probably a good time for some of that famous human directness. "Chancellor," I said, and my voice carried clearly across the acoustically perfect chamber, "let me save everyone some time here. You're all wondering whether humanity just revealed that we've been lying about being peaceful for the past 2 centuries. The answer is no. We are peaceful. We're just not stupid." A ripple of nervous chittering, clicking, and harmonic resonance went through the assembled delegates. The crystalline representative actually flickered through several colors I'm pretty sure meant "oh dear" in light spectrum. "You see," I continued, gesturing to the children beside me, "we learned a long time ago that being peaceful doesn't mean being helpless. It means being strong enough to choose not to fight. But when someone decides to bomb children, well, that's when the choice gets made for us." Little Spike raised one carefully controlled claw. I nodded at him, and his voice, run through the universal translator, echoed through the chamber with all the authority of a 6-year-old who had survived something no child should have to. "The bad birds hurt my friends," he said simply. "Commander Tank says humans don't let people hurt children, ever." The silence that followed could have been measured in geological epochs. Chancellor Vex Thran looked like he was trying to swallow something unpleasant. "Commander, the Council is concerned about the implications of humanity's demonstrated military capabilities. Perhaps we could discuss some form of regulatory framework." That's when Admiral Thompson decided to join the conversation, and his voice had all the diplomatic subtlety of an orbital bombardment. "Chancellor, let me make this real simple for everyone. As of right now, the Terran Defense Force is implementing what we're calling the human doctrine. Anyone, anywhere, who targets non-combatants, especially children, gets to meet the part of humanity that conquered our own planet and then spent 2 centuries getting really, really good at warfare. The Vorthan ambassador made a sound that his translator rendered as, "But surely there must be some process, some diplomatic procedure." I looked at him, then at the rest of the assembly, and realized this was one of those moments that define how the next few centuries are going to go. "There is a process," I said, and I made sure my voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "Don't hurt children. That's the entire process. You want to fight your wars, conquer your territories, settle your disputes? Fine. Humans will provide medical aid, refugee assistance, and disaster relief, just like we always have. But the moment you target kids, you get to discover exactly why our species made it off our home planet in the first place." Admiral Thompson stepped forward, and somehow he managed to look both relaxed and absolutely terrifying at the same time. "The Council might also be interested to know that we've taken custody of General Screech Talondath. He's currently serving his sentence." "What sentence?" Chancellor Vextron asked, though he looked like he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Community service," I replied, and I couldn't keep the grin off my face. "He's working at our rebuilt orphanage, diaper duty mostly. Turns out that when you force someone who thinks children are acceptable targets to actually take care of kids, they develop some interesting perspectives on their life choices." The chamber erupted in what I can only describe as confused diplomatic panic. Various species were trying to process the idea that humanity's idea of justice involved forced childcare rather than execution or imprisonment. "He's actually getting pretty good at finger-painting supervision," I added, "though he still has trouble with story time, something about his voice making the kids nervous." Ambassador Thex from the Regalian Confederacy raised a tentacle. "Commander, what assurances can you give the Council that humanity won't use this military capability for conquest?" That's when Little Gloop decided to contribute to galactic diplomacy. His translator rendered his burbling as, "Humans give the best hugs. Why would they want to conquer people when they could hug them instead?" The crystalline representative flickered through what I was pretty sure were colors of philosophical contemplation. "There's your answer," I said. "We didn't spend 2 centuries perfecting the art of war so we could rule the galaxy. We did it so we could protect the parts of the galaxy worth protecting. And kids, regardless of species, are always worth protecting." Chancellor Vexthran looked around the chamber, taking in the faces of representatives from hundreds of worlds, all of whom were rapidly recalculating their relationships with humanity. "The Council recognizes the human doctrine," he said finally, and his voice carried the weight of historical inevitability. "Let it be recorded that as of this date, the Terran Defense Force serves as the protector of non-combatants throughout Galactic Council space." Admiral Thompson nodded gravely. "We accept the responsibility, Chancellor. And just so everyone's clear on the parameters, our definition of non-combatant includes anyone under the age of majority for their species, anyone providing medical care, anyone providing educational services, and anyone whose primary function is making the galaxy a better place." "That's quite comprehensive," the Chancellor replied weakly. "We believe in being thorough," the Admiral said cheerfully. And that was how humanity officially became the galaxy's kindergarten teachers and enforcers simultaneously. A job description that would have been completely ridiculous if we hadn't just demonstrated exactly why we were qualified for both roles. 6 months later, I was back to my regular routine of mediating playground disputes and trying to explain to young crystallines why they couldn't refract light directly into their friends' optical sensors during nap time. The new facility was bigger, better, and came with some interesting upgrades that hadn't been in the original blueprints. For instance, the swing sets were now manufactured from the same materials we used for starship hulls, because apparently some bureaucrat in Earth Defense had decided that if someone was going to bomb a playground again, they were going to have to work a lot harder for it. The sandbox had been redesigned with a retractable shield generator that could deploy faster than you could say, "Incoming plasma torpedo," and the jungle gym? Let's just say it doubled as a sensor array that could detect hostile intent from 3 star systems away. But the biggest change wasn't the military-grade playground equipment, it was the view. Every morning when I stepped outside to begin the daily head count of various alien offspring, I could see them hanging in the sky like metallic guardian angels. The orbital defense platforms that Admiral Thompson had personally insisted on installing. "Just in case," he'd said, "someone else gets any bright ideas about acceptable targets." The platforms were beautiful in their own way, all graceful curves and gleaming armor plating, but they had the kind of beauty that whispered, "Approach with caution," to anyone with functioning survival instincts. Each one was equipped with enough firepower to reduce a battle fleet to its component atoms, and they were staffed by humans who had volunteered specifically for the job of making sure no one ever again mistook Earth's children for acceptable casualties. "Commander Tank," came a familiar voice from the direction of the Arts and Crafts Pavilion. I turned to see General Screech Talondeath, formerly the terror of 3 sectors, now wearing an apron decorated with finger-painted handprints from about 30 different species. He was carefully supervising a group of young Vorthans who were attempting to create sculptures from what appeared to be luminescent clay. "General," I replied, because even though he was technically our prisoner, the kids had gotten attached to him, and he'd actually turned out to be surprisingly good at this whole childcare thing once you got past his tendency to screech military commands when he got excited. "How's the art therapy going?" "Small Verthan-designated Harmony has achieved structural integrity in her clay formation," he reported in his naturally aggressive-sounding language, which the translator rendered as, "Little Harmony made a really nice bowl. I have provided tactical guidance on optimal appendage positioning for maximum creative effectiveness." I watched as he gently guided a young Vorthon's manipulator appendages to help her smooth out the edges of what was indeed a very nice bowl, and I had to admit that our unconventional rehabilitation program was working better than anyone had expected. "You know, General," I said, settling into the kind of casual conversation that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, "when we first captured you, I figured you were going to be a problem." Screech's head tilted in what I'd learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "Commander Tank, when you first captured me, I expected execution or imprisonment. I did not expect to discover that small beings require consistent nutritional input and emotional reassurance to achieve optimal development patterns." "I might grow on you," I agreed, watching as little Spike carefully helped a new arrival, a tiny ridge alien whose parents had been lost in a transport accident, figure out how the swing set worked. "Indeed," Screech replied, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there 6 months ago, something that might have been contentment. "I have submitted a formal request to extend my community service sentence." I raised an eyebrow. "Screech, your original sentence was complete after 4 months. You've been volunteering for the last 2. "The small beings require consistency," he said, and his translator somehow managed to convey embarrassment. "Also, Small Gloop Entity has requested that I read him the story about the brave warrior who learned to garden. He finds my voice soothing." Before I could respond to this latest development in interspecies relations, my comm unit chimed with an incoming message. The sender ID made me smile. It was Captain Wrench Rodriguez, now commanding the orbital platform designated Playground Guardian. "Tank, we've got incoming traffic." Her voice came through with professional efficiency. "Looks like a delegation from the Andromedan Cooperative. They're requesting permission to discuss enrollment procedures for their displaced youth program." I looked around at our facility, taking in the sight of dozens of alien children playing, learning, and growing under the protection of the most advanced military technology humanity had ever developed. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Permission granted, Wrench. Send them down to Landing Bay 3 and make sure they get the full tour." "Copy that. And Tank, they're bringing about 50 kids with them. Hope you've got room." I looked at the new dormitory wings we'd been constructing, designed to accommodate the steady stream of requests from species across the galaxy who had suddenly decided that maybe leaving their most vulnerable members in human care wasn't such a bad idea after all. Funny how being protected by the galaxy's most efficient military had turned into excellent marketing for our childcare services. "We'll make room," I replied. "We always make room." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself in my old spot by the main playground, watching the controlled chaos of interspecies childhood play out under the watchful eyes of both human caregivers and orbital defense platforms. A group of young crystallines were teaching some Thracian cubs how to refract light into pretty patterns. Several Outarian tadpoles were building elaborate sandcastles, with the help of a Regelian youngling who could manipulate sand with her tentacles in ways that defied physics. And in the middle of it all, little Gloop was indeed listening with rapt attention as General Screech read from a book about gardening with a voice that had once issued orders to destroy entire worlds. The universe, I reflected, had a sense of humor that was either deeply twisted or profoundly hopeful, depending on your perspective. My comm chimed again, this time with a message from Admiral Thompson. "Tank, how's retirement treating you?" I looked up at the sky, where human warships moved in careful patterns between the stars, carrying medical supplies to disaster zones and rescue equipment to stranded colonies. I looked at the orbital platforms that stood ready to respond to any threat against the innocent. I looked at the children playing in gardens that had been built from the ashes of a bombed playground. "Admiral," I replied, "I wouldn't call this retirement. I'd call it the job I was always meant to do." "Copy that, Tank. Sweet dreams." As the sun set over our little corner of the galaxy, I helped tuck 67 alien children of 15 different species into beds designed specifically for their unique physiologies. I read bedtime stories in languages that humans had learned specifically so no child would have to go to sleep feeling alone and afraid. I listened to lullabies that parents had taught their children before circumstances beyond their control had brought those children to our care. And when the last light had been dimmed, and the last small voice had whispered goodnight in whatever language carried the weight of home, I stood in the doorway of our facility and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, other species were fighting their wars, pursuing their ambitions, building their empires. Somewhere out there, the galaxy continued to spin through space, indifferent to the small dramas of individual lives. But here, in this small corner of human space, 67 children from across the galaxy were sleeping safely under the protection of a species that had learned to turn swords into plowshares and plowshares into shields. The monsters, as I'd promised them 6 months ago, were indeed more afraid of us than they would ever be of them. And that, I thought, as I headed inside to review tomorrow's lesson plans, was exactly how it should be. Sleep tight, kids. The universe is a big, scary place, but you're not alone in it. Not anymore. Not ever again.